Good afternoon, and thank you very much for allowing me some time this late part of the day. It's a bit like the graveyard session, although there's dinner to be served hereafter, and I would guess some drinks and some booze as well. So the students will definitely stay, and I will definitely stay as well. So I hope I'll be able to keep you awake. I know my next speaker will definitely, and we'll have a good time later. So, after listening to Dr. Agnes, I almost thought, whatever I want to say now is kind of silly. It's like, it'll be over-theoretical in a way. It'll be, what can I improve? There's nothing I can say that can improve on what she said. So I just want to again acknowledge the work, and I hope that you've all listened carefully to what Dr. Agnes was saying this afternoon. I mean, if you take her speech and you unpack what she was saying, I think you've got everything around leadership as we need it today in the world, not only in Africa, but in the world. So I think you are doing just smashing work, and you're a rock star. I only met you yesterday, and I've known about you, but it's such a privilege to listen to you. And you'll see her becoming like Wangari Maathai with the Million Trees movement, and hopefully she will be a Nobel laureate in a couple of years, or the president of Uganda, or something like that, So, yeah. So, thank you very much. Let me fire off. I usually start by dedicating my lectures to the late Chief Albert John Luthuli, whom my center at the University of Pretoria is named after. He was a remarkable man. This year we are commemorating 50 years of his passing. He was a struggle fighter and a freedom fighter in South Africa, one of the presidents of the African National Congress, and something that I think most of you might not know, and that he was the first African to receive the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1960. And the then government of South Africa didn't even allow him to go to Oslo to receive the award. So we are named after him. He's a remarkable man. He was a remarkable man, and his legacies still live on as we speak today. And the fact that we are called the Centre for Responsible Leadership makes a lot of sense because he was the epitome of what it meant to be responsible to society and building society and painting a picture of the kind of world or the kind of country that he saw South Africa to be. And I think we became that, even with our current challenges that we are faced with. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon, and this is my agenda, and I'll run through it. Most importantly, I think what I want to say is that I'm not going to give you the conventional kind of speech about what is leadership. We've deliberately decided to throw leadership and leadership in Africa around and just to turn it inside out. So I'm not going to tell you this afternoon that leadership is A, B, and C, and we decided to go and look for A, B, and C in the continent, and we found A, B, and C, or we critique the elements of leadership or the qualities of leadership. We decided to be very unconventional in our quest to understand leadership in Africa. And we developed a program or did a research that was called Leadership for Africa. Not leadership in Africa or leadership by Africa, but leadership for Africa. So the LFA project was basically created. So I'm going to talk a bit about the project and then share with you some of the early expressions of leadership, how we understood them through the project that we did and the research we did. And this project commenced, I think, in 2012, and it was done and finished by the end of 2014, early 2015. The work was published in the Leadership Journal, and with some decent citations. As an academic, I always have to kind of say that part as well. So there's some decent citations coming out on this paper. It was the first study ever done on the 60-year review of leadership research on the African continent. So, change in Africa is synonymous, and leadership in change is crucial. We experience that every single day. I mean, as recent as yesterday with what's happening in Zimbabwe, there's change. South Africa is about change. It's constant. It's a moving target. The literature on leadership in Africa is rather lopsided, dominated by the global north, and until fairly recently, it was mostly the West that wrote about African leadership, or the global north. Leadership scholars have increased over the past 10 years or so, but not to the extent that we would like to. So more work is needed to describe, investigate, and understand leadership in Africa by Africans and by African scholars. So that's why the Leadership for Africa project was created. So why did we do it? We need to contribute to theory, first of all, and leadership theory in Africa, but we also have to make sure that we contribute to the understanding of leadership of people in top leadership positions, whether it's government, civil society, or business, but more importantly also to contribute to policy-making issues. Because once you understand leadership in Africa, you'll obviously be able to also influence and contribute to policy and other developmental interventions. And then obviously strengthening the synergy between academia, where we do research on African leadership or leadership in Africa, but also the implications of that, and then obviously ultimately translating that kind of research into what does it mean in terms of training and developing the next generation leaders. So we decided, so how are we going to do this? As I said earlier, we're not going to say, well, there's theory or existing theory, or let's adopt a particular theory about leadership and go and look for that qualities or for that theory and test the theory in Africa or in a country or in a couple of countries, and then either confirm that the theory is relevant or critique the theory or add some elements to the body of knowledge about the theory. We said, not interested. What we are interested in is to understand transformational change. We need to understand what does it mean for a country or a continent or a region to undergo significant radical transformation. And if we understand what transformation means and change means, we might be in a position to then backcast and ask the question, but what do we understand and learn about leadership once we've understood change or transformational change? And that's simply what the project was about. So there were 3 steps that we took. And the study was piloted and the results are based on Tanzanian case. So first we looked for stories of change, narratives. And we explored extensively in Tanzania for those stories. And we got around 300 odd stories that met the definition. And I'll give the definition in a second. Then we changed these stories into cases, but we filtered these stories to only select those stories that met the definition of change. So there were very strict criteria built into what is transformational change. And then we looked at all these stories, and whatever dropped out were the stories that we felt really explained change in that country. Only at that point, once we've got 1 or 2 or 3 stories of change, did we start asking the question, so what does this tell us about leadership? So that was the process. So methodologically, we had to decide what is transformational change and what is leadership. So we decided on those 2 definitions. So change in structures and systems reflects a change in the underpinning interpretive scheme. I'll give another one just now. Leadership, as we've said there, there's a plethora of definitions of leadership, as you all know. So we decided, let's simplify and basically use that definition for the purposes of our study. But remember, we did not go into this exercise to try and look for these type of leaders. We just had to have some broad understanding of what a leader or leadership basically is. We were more interested in change. In terms of scope, it's basically transformational changes by moving from one archetypal configuration to another. So it means radical change. The end of apartheid in South Africa and the start of democracy is an example of radical change. But we also say this is the determining dimension and requires qualitative and contextual motivations. From a form point of view, it is not only non-linear replacement of existing archetypal configurations, but it could also be linear and ongoing. And then the pace could be episodic or it could be continuous. So that's basically what change is. In simple terms, radical transformation. moving from one dispensational way of doing things to another. If these stories didn't match up to these radical changes, we didn't even look at them. We were very, very stuck on only looking for stories in Tanzania that resembles radical change, because those stories gives you a good understanding of leadership. So we had level descriptors, and we had sphere descriptors and issue descriptors. So let me make it simple. Level descriptors, we looked at individual leadership, institutional, and collective. So it's important to look at the level of analysis of leadership in cases like this. We did not go and look only for the individual person, because chances were anyway that if we were looking for the individual leader, that it might have been a male in a senior, fairly senior position in business or government or whatever. So we deliberately said it needs to be institutional, but also collective. The spheres are political, business, and then civil society. So the story should also resemble or should fit into that. We're not only looking for political stories. And as you could imagine, the work that was done and the leadership that was written up in Africa mostly was about political leadership. Very often you would find stories and narratives about leadership that actually speaks to, for example, the Mama Rice project that Dr. Agnes was telling us about. Most of the written up stories, yesterday evening or last night when we had dinner, I said, but Agnes, we need to write up your work. It needs to be written up in a case study or in a book or we just need to, celebrate what you are doing. But mostly it's political leadership stuff that gets written up, and we deliberately decide to look for more. And issue descriptors, what are the stuff that we were interested in terms of understanding on the African continent? And we used the African Union's thematic areas, and it includes those areas. You can pretty much say it's similar to the SDGs anyway. So these were the filters. So we said, not only looking at individuals, it needs to be institutional and collectives. Not only looking at political, it needs to be business and civil society. And it needs to cover all issues. We're not only looking for child mortality or food security or human rights issues. We look for a number of stories that basically resembles this transformational change. The literature is interesting around leadership. Suffice to say that there's a massive need for development, for leadership development material on the African continent. Furthermore, the expressions of African leadership is rather nebulous and quite complicated, if you think about it, and if you go and read into the literature. And I urge you to go and look at the article in the Leadership Journal that is about the 60-year review of literature of African leadership. If this center at Zeppelin is interested in transcultural work, it's very important to dig yourself into the leadership literature on the African continent. A lot of work around leadership and gender, but a lot more work needed. And then leadership and significant concepts like colonialism and like religion. These are all very interesting aspects that we could find in the review of the African literature around leadership. In terms of publications in the 1990s to 1999, predominantly about political leadership, leadership and management. This is what was covered in the literature. Again, 85% of the 60 years of literature on African leadership was written by non-Africans. Okay. And then in the 2000 to 2010 period, again, slightly more work done on research on African leadership by African scholars, but again, mostly still by non-Africans. And the topics that were covered there, leadership and management, leadership and African values, leadership and gender, political leadership, leadership and socio-economic development, and leadership in education. Not surprising that these are the predominant areas that were covered. So I'm now going to give you the 3 case studies that we identified. So these 3 stories are the stories that were filtered through these processes. 300 stories, more or less, build it into case studies, select those 3 stories that we believed resembles transformational change the most. The first one in Tanzania was infrastructure and significant change in infrastructure in the period 2002 to 2012. So that's the first case. I'm not going to cover the bullets. You you can read for yourself and see what basically the detail of that case was. The next case was gender, not surprising. The increase of women in leadership-making bodies between 2002 and 2012 in Tanzania. In parliament, legislation, number of women in constituency seats in key ministerial positions, changing targets by the AU, and changes in civic activism. So women and the role of women and the changes of gender issues in Tanzania was the second story. So I must also just add a caveat to that by saying, since we've stopped the research, we haven't gone back and made sure to what extent, for example, the gender issue in Tanzania is still improving, and to what extent it might have actually plateaued in a way, and there's no work really on gender, and like we found in this study, taking place any longer. I don't know, Dr. Agnes, if you know anything more about Tanzania and gender, or if it's still pretty much the same. Pretty much the same. And then the last one is HIV and AIDS, significant improvement around awareness, testing, policy and planning, strategic initiatives in Tanzania. So these were the stories. Up to that point, we didn't want to know what the leadership issues were. We said, these are the stories. And then we took each of these stories and we started asking questions about leadership. Who were they? Were they individuals? Were they men? Were they female? We interviewed people that were involved in that process of getting women in, for example, that case in Tanzania to give their rightful stand in society. So we interviewed women. We looked at media clippings over a period of 10 years. We looked at organizations. We looked at civil society movements. So we did extensive investigation in trying to understand leadership. Who were they? Were it institutions? Were it individuals that actually brought that change to the fore? And only then will we be able to understand what leadership is. So our findings were, again, at three levels, at an institutional level, at a collective level, and at an individual level. So all three of these levels about leadership were important in terms of making changes and transformation. So at a legislation and policy perspective, and approving and making sufficient funding available. So leadership at an institution level were crucial in terms of giving human, female and gender rights issues and to advance that into the future. At a collective level, partnerships, networks, partnerships, stakeholders getting involved, mobilizing groups from community-based organizations to government, to civil society, to business. They all formed partnerships to start acting as a pressure towards getting women and gender issues its rightful place in Tanzania. So at a collective level, we realized transformative partnerships. So partnerships that were fundamentally interested in transformation. So they all came together, bound by this common element of saying, we need to change and make sure that women get their rightful position in Tanzanian society. And then at an individual level, it's agency. We all know agency theory. I think that's probably something that students at a liberal arts university like Zeppelin have been studied, what agency theory is. So in this case, it was very, very profound what we realized, and that is the ability of the individual to act as an agent and to be responsible for others and to act on behalf of others and to take care and to take that ownership almost. So that individual ownership of the leader was very important. Skills and support structures. So Dr. Agnes was talking about support structures. How important it is in her community for women to support each other, for the men to support the women, for other support structures. A great part of her job is to ensure that those women that are empowered, when they go back home to their men, to their husbands, they can still cope in a very patriarchal manner. So the support structures are crucial for women to survive and for women to actually occupy their rightful places. So if you look at the work we did, we realized our expressions of leadership was at these three levels important to understand, at the individual, at the institutional, and at the collective level. So, a few concluding remarks. So, we at least understand better the link between leadership and transformational change. We explicitly deviated from your conventional way of leadership by going in with an understanding of leadership and trying to understand whether these leadership qualities exist or not. We said no, we are interested in transformational change, examples of how the country has changed. And then from that look back and say, but what is it about leadership that were interesting, and how can we investigate leadership better? So as I said, the lessons from an institutional, collective and an individual level was quite interesting. So transformational change and transcultural leadership, one needs to ask the question, what are the connecting points between this? I believe South Africa, the continent, is a very complex system in transition. And I think it allows for a lot of complex adaptive systems and adaptive spaces where you would need emergence and allow for emergence. So if you go into complexity leadership theory, which Professor Mary Ubin talks a lot about, and I think she was at Zeppelin last year or earlier this year, I can't remember, where she spoke about this. So the bottom line is, if you look at transformational change and if you look at transcultural realities, what you find is systems complex systems or complex societies in transition. What Dr. Agnes explained is a complex society in transition. The complexity for 10,900 women to suddenly have access to funding, to a cell phone, to 2 tractors, only 2. And she told me last night that when the first tractor arrived, it was like it was like everybody ran and looked at what this machine is capable of doing. So you can imagine how that system, complex system of the women, their relationship with their husbands, with society, their maternal role, their health, how that is changing and to what extent it requires a kind of leadership that I don't think we've really written up, to be frank. But I think what's important in Africa is to reclaim socio-cultural resources. The African continent needs to reclaim socio-cultural resources, which I think was suppressed for many years by the colonial impact. And it needs to be reclaimed. I think leadership authenticity on the African continent lies in 3 clusters: religion, ethnicity, and African values. We need to understand the rich connectivity that exists between these examples of growth and change and societal improvement and transformation and other systems in society, whether it's government systems or whether it's the role of business. We were talking about getting rural banks into a project like that. At the moment, they work on cash, and they've got an annual turnover of about $500,000 at the moment. And 3,000 tons, or how many tons? 5,000 tons of rice per annum. So it's a lot of rice produced. It's a lot of rice by, a couple of women over the past couple of years. So, we also see blurring lines between various cultures. That's why the transculturality is so important that Professor Wieland spoke about. There's significant shift in configurations in society, and I don't think we understand that well, and let alone the fact how leadership manifests in such difficult transitions in society. And then I think there's not enough critique of uncritical use of Western theory to leadership in Africa. We have to critique Western theory on leadership in Africa. And I don't want to be over anti-colonialist, but let me tell you, from where I come in our university, we've had severe student activism last year. You might have seen it in South Africa. And most of that was also about decolonizing the curriculum. So we had students burn down campuses because we have to decolonize the curriculum. So if you think about the complexity of this, and this is just a side comment, we have to be very critical of our understanding of Western theory of leadership. So by concluding remarks, last slide, is, so how do you develop leaders? I think, the following aspects we need to bear in mind at least. We've grappled with the topic around can you develop somebody to be responsible? Can you develop somebody to be an ethical person? I don't know, there's a lot of work, we've got great experts in this room about that, but what I think we should bear in mind and at least be aware of, if we start contemplating what developing responsible leaders and citizens in Africa would be, I think the following aspects we need to remember, and that is increasingly the issue of relationality and obviously authenticity. When Dr. Agnes answered the question about growth and about development, her answer was so bloody simple, but to the point. I mean, it's about food. It's about having money to go to the hospital, to pay for the doctor or the nurse, or to be able to have childbirth in fairly okay conditions where the mother doesn't die or the child doesn't die. That's development. That's the real deal. Let's not be over-theoretical about this. I think solidarity with followers. Followership is a very interesting thing in Africa, very interesting. It's a phenomenon that requires extensive research. Leading complex processes and the societal relevance of that. Make no mistake, what Dr. Agnes is doing is not a piece of cake, like the ones we had during the break. Actually, that rhymed. It's not simple. It's complex. And once you also bear in mind the societal value of such complex processes, it makes it a very difficult task. You have to bear that in mind if you develop leaders. Collective and social capital, shared meaning of development, dialogue on socio-cultural resources, social change and in search of goodness. These, so I deliberately decided not to give you the ABC of how to develop leaders and Bob's your uncle and we go home and we all live happily ever after. Unfortunately, not as simple as that. We live in a complex world, and I always say it's like the difference between a jazz band and a symphony orchestra. We live in a jazz band world, and we constantly put a symphony orchestra conductor in front of a jazz band. Not going to work. Not going to work. You need to allow for emergence, and you need to allow for some messiness, because a jazz band is messy. It's not perfect. There's no one leader. The percussionist might take the lead, and then the bass guitarist might take the lead later. It's complex. A symphony orchestra is complicated. It's like an aeroplane. It's complicated. Mayonnaise is complex. So Africa is very, very complex, and it's a bit of a jazz band scenario. So a lot of work to be done to understand leadership and leadership development. But again, and I'm going to close with that, and Dr. Agnes is not paying me to say all of these good things about her, but I mean, if we just listen to what she said, you can go home and sleep easy tonight, because that's what it's about. Thank you.